All right, we end our course together looking at heroes, and so the course chapters in the Apollo book will walk you through you would I guess you could call kind of the greatest hits of the Greek mythological hero tales: Heracles, Jason, Theseus, and Perseus. And but with this presentation this week, what I want to do is kind of telescope back, look at the kind of hero tales as in a bit more of a broader sense, and look at kind of how kind of hero narratives work and how we might connect these Greek hero tales to kind of the larger kind of hero narratives told around the world, and just to give us a better understanding of kind of how hero narratives work, what kind of elements they return to, and I always find this part of the course particularly fascinating and actually incredibly useful in terms of looking at the movies that I like to watch and the books that I like to read. Kind of understanding kind of how the journey of the hero works has been endlessly valuable, certainly personally to me, in a kind of understanding kind of the twists and turns that narratives make, and why they make those twists and turns. So we begin with our consideration of the guy that you see here, Joseph Campbell. He is arguably, probably in the last certainly in the last century, one of the most influential kind of popular academics that really changed the way that we kind of understand narratives on the screen and on the page. And he's best known for this book that he wrote, I think it was back in the 1950s, called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And since he's written it, it's never been out of print. And his basic thesis was that if you look at hero tales from around the world, and you really kind of break down their elements in terms of the kind of the stages that a hero goes through, the kind of people that he meets along the way, the kind of adventures that he or she goes through. What you find is that it doesn't matter who's telling the story. It could be a Greek myth, a Norse myth, it could be a story told by an indigenous population whose stories have never been written down or heard before. Campbell says you'll find these same patterns around the world. And so Campbell, what he did as part of this massive project is he traveled the world and collected stories, and he put them side by side, and he developed this thesis that we now know as kind of the narrative archetypes of the hero's journey. So the hero with a thousand faces, this idea is that choose a hero and replace the mask of the hero with another mask, and you can at root you can reasonably expect that you're kind of telling the same story, no matter kind of where you go in the world. And for Campbell, who, as I understand it, was not a traditionally religious man, this was kind of his religion. He saw this as a kind of a binding thing that bound humanity together kind of across the ages. And for him, it was this mysterious thing that he was very much a disciple of Carl Jung, who posited this notion of there's a collective unconscious that all of humanity shares, if only we could kind of lift the veil and get a peek at it. For Campbell, kind of looking at the hero journey was a way of kind of lifting the veil and explaining why, or at least how, humanity over centuries, over millennia. He also said it doesn't matter kind of when you're talking about either. You could be talking about the ancient Greeks, you could be talking about people, screenwriters, writing hero stories right now for the screen. They're all tapping into this same kind of thing. So he developed this notion that he called the monomyth, which is a bit overstated. This is a theory that's kind of out of favor these days, where academia is much more intent on focusing on the differences between cultures and the unique and original things that cultures bring to the tale. Fair enough, rather than kind of looking at what links them together. Monomyth, this idea, there's kind of one story. It's a bit overstated even in Campbell's own book, but this idea that every hero goes through a cycle, going out from the known to the unknown, facing the monsters, the demons, be they real or figurative, maturing into something greater, hopefully getting past those challenges, and then ultimately returning home, but changed forever. And you can see by even the little cartoon here is that what famous kind of myth of the last 30 years is implied here? The Lion King. The Lion King is actually a classic hero's journey, and is one of these stories that was actually deliberately patterned on Campbell's ideas. In fact, one of the most famous things that people know about Campbell is that he was a mentor to George Lucas. And Campbell's ideas were fundamental in developing the Star Wars mythology. In fact, there's a famous story that George Lucas, as a young man at USC Film School, he was working on many projects, but he developed an early draft of what would become the first Star Wars film. And he did this not knowing anything about Joseph Campbell, nothing about the hero's journey. This is where we're talking about late 60s, early 70s. And one day a friend came to him and had read this book, Hero with a Thousand Faces, and said, "Have you heard this about this? And George, I know you're interested in myths and storytelling. This might be really useful." So Lucas read the book, and he was blown away. And the thing that blew him away is that he looked at Campbell's ideas and these stages that the hero says that goes through, the people he meets along the way, the allies, the friends, the enemies, the cycles that the hero goes through. He looked at that, and then he looked at his own script that he wrote for the Luke Skywalker saga, and says, "Oh my gosh, I just wrote that story," and it blew him away. He couldn't believe it, and so that convinced him that Campbell had tapped into something. And then after that, he went back. He rewrote the script to kind of more strictly map out against the stages of Campbell's journey. And of course, there's no, whatever you think of the Star Wars mythology, there's no arguing with its success. It's probably one of the greatest modern myths that's got its hooks into the culture over the last 50 years, right? And so Lucas was absolutely convinced that Campbell was onto something, and then in later life, Campbell became a friend and mentor to Lucas himself. So here's another just a graphic I found that kind of shows it in more detail. There are various, and this is not kind of a hard and fast kind of thing. One of the beauties of the hero's journey is that it's endlessly tweakable. Again, if every hero journey that we ever read or watched, followed just these rote steps, it would become very, very dull very, very quickly. But Campbell's one of the things he noticed is that it's a flexible enough structure that at root you can say we're all telling the same kind of going out and return story, but there's endless ways to play with the formula along the way that keep it interesting. So the hero is called from home. He has to, like I said, leave the known world for the unknown world. And crossing these thresholds, the hero is a liminal figure. Heroes cross boundaries that others don't. He'll meet helpers and mentors along the way. So maybe some minor challenges along the way that kind of test his or her mettle as a hero. But ultimately, very often hero stories will culminate into kind of one grand confrontation. So whether that be Harry confronting Voldemort, or Luke destroying the Death Star, or Frodo bringing the ring to Mount Doom, there's always some kind of descent, be it a literal descent, figurative descent, some kind of confrontation with death that the hero must get past. The Greeks even had a word for it. They called it the katabasis, the going below, kata down, basis to go, going under, as kind of the darkest place that a hero can go. So think about Odysseus, right in the middle of his journey, going down into Hades. It's the lowest a hero can go. It's the most literal confrontation with death that a hero can go and emerge from and remain alive. And the hero, hopefully, unless is lost in that dark abyss of death, comes out transformed. There's often hero journeys will have kind of a cost. Often friends or family will die and not return. And then ultimately the hero returns home forever changed by what the hero has gone through. Now, in this presentation, I'm going to talk about how masculine journeys and feminine journeys by and large tend to fall, they tend to unfold in distinct kind of ways. Now this is changing. Certainly in the last 30 years, I would say there's a much more of a fluidity between what we would call kind of a feminine and masculine journey, or a feminine heroine and a masculine hero. I mean, a lot of this is owing to kind of the changing culture and the rise of feminism and such. But if you're looking at the stories kind of throughout human history, yes, by and large, male stories and female stories tend to kind of unfold in distinct ways. There's certainly overlap between them as well. So we start with a masculine journey. Masculine journeys often begin with some sort of loss. It's often the loss of a father or a father figure. Kind of that the son-father relationship is so intensely important in many, not all, but in many masculine hero stories. If you think about, Harry Potter has lost his parents. Luke, of course, his father. He does not know that Darth Vader is his father. So there's some kind of the loss of that relationship in particular is central, and so and that loss is often kind of undergirds the hero leaving home. The hero is sent on some kind of quest. He's called to adventure, and he's in search of a lost person or a lost object. But ultimately, that loss of kind of identity. Male journeys tend to be very strictly centered around personal identity, and often that identity with relationship to the father in particular. Along the way, the hero meets two helpers. Again, this is not always rote, but it's common. The hero meets first kind of a young female figure who kind of encourages the hero in his darkest hour, or encourages him when he's on the verge of giving up, and then points the hero to the second helper. And the second helper is usually the principal mentor figure, an old, wise male figure who provides information to facilitate the hero's journey. So you think about Luke Skywalker has Obi-Wan Kenobi, has Yoda fulfilling this role. Frodo and Bilbo have Gandalf fulfilling this role. The hero will ultimately kind of reach some sort of kind of ultimate descent. Like I said, it's often a literal descent at night down into a cave or a grotto beneath the Earth's surface. I mean, not always, but very often. And it's that association with the underground, with death, with the tomb. That's what's really going on here. And then there's often a number of physical challenges that the hero and the hero's friends have to face, and then ultimately they cross some kind of ultimate boundary. Again, there's that hero as a liminal figure into the darkest part of the underworld, and it's very often that the hero has to face this alone. And so it's across that final boundary where the hero has to kind of face the monster, Cerberus, or encounter with Hades or Persephone, or name your famous mythological monster, Medusa, the Minotaur, getting the golden fleece. All of this would kind of roughly correspond to what we're talking about here. And so the young man either finds the object of his pursuit, or if it's a monster that the hero has to slay, slays the monster, or finds that it's impossible, or the lost object is unattainable. I would say usually the hero kills the monster, gets the object, and emerges. And then the hero returns, makes his way back home. But here's that atonement piece. Often there's a deep cost. The death of a substitute. That would be, a friend, a companion who's been them most of the way. Or sometimes the quest object itself is lost, and the hero returns empty-handed. Devastation. This is a piece that, at least in my opinion, in kind of modern hero stories, you tend not to see. That the young man ultimately returns home, but finds that his home is in chaos. Because he's left. The hero is the protector of his homeland, but when he goes off on his quest, he leaves his homeland unprotected. I think part of this is that we, modern culture has kind of this love affair with the happy ending. And when the hero comes home, he comes home to a hero's welcome. But if you think about it, again, if you know your Lord of the Rings mythology, this is not something that was in the films. But when Frodo returns back to Hobbiton, there's more battles to be won. There's an episode in the books called The Scouring of the Shire, and there's still monsters, there's still enemies to be defeated. It goes on there. And that was an aspect of that the films, although I thought the films did a really nice job with those books, skipped over. So if we were to kind of map this idea onto a famous myth of the last 20 years or so, and one that I'm guessing that most of you have some traffic with. If you look at Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, the very first book, first film in the Harry Potter series, loss. Young man loses someone or something to which the foundation of his identity is tied. Harry has lost his parents and does not fully understand his identity. He's living, with the Dursleys, with the Muggle family. He has no idea who he is. And then there's the kind of the Sorcerer's Stone itself that plays this role as this kind of forbidden object. Throughout this first story. Quest: the young man leaves home in search of a lost person or thing. Harry leaves the Muggle world for Hogwarts and starts to kind of learn about who he is, who his parents were, understanding that he's kind of this famous figure who is marked by fate or destiny. And then there to the kind of the Sorcerer's Stone, he goes into the Gringotts Bank, or with Hagrid, who very mysteriously picks up this object from the vault. Meets two helpers along the way. Usually, the first helper is a young female and directs the hero to the second helper. Kind of here. I mean, certainly Hermione. She shows up on the train, as she's kind of the know-it-all. She's been practicing her spells. She knows the ins and outs of Hogwarts, and Harry is, again, he's completely, everything is new to him. Ron, to a lesser extent, even though he's not female, kind of plays this comic role, but he comes alongside Harry and kind of eases this transition. And then the second helper is usually an old, wise male figure who provides information to facilitate the hero's journey. The obvious one here would be, Dumbledore. He's kind of our Gandalf. He's our Yoda in this story. But Hagrid and Firenze, the Centaur, also play this role in this first book. The Catabasis is the descent. The young man descends at night through an opening in the Earth's surface. There's lots of these kind of catabases in that first book. There's lots of these forbidden dark places, the forest, the corridor. But ultimately, it's that underground chamber where ultimately Harry has his first face-to-face confrontation with Voldemort. And he goes there, and there's lots of things that they have to get past to make their way to that final challenge. They have to get past Fluffy, the three-headed dog, which is a clear tag to Cerberus from the Greek myths. The deadly plant, the flying keys. They have to get past a game of wizard's chess, all moving towards that ultimate boundary into a dark underworld. So get deeper and deeper past these challenges, where they encounter some sort of monster that represents death here. So yes, I mean, Fluffy represents that. Of course, Voldemort is the great example of death here, or representative of death. And of course, in these previous challenges, he goes down there with Hermione and Ron, but he has to ultimately face death alone. And that's a classic masculine hero's journey. The object is found. He finds it or finds it's unattainable. Certainly in terms of Harry's own identity, he begins to learn about his parents. He learns about himself and kind of his place in this universe. The Sorcerer's Stone is ultimately kept out of the hands of Voldemort and is destroyed, lest its power fall into the wrong hands. Then a return. Young man returns home, but only at the cost of the death of substitutes, either the hero's companion or the quest object. Harry wakes up in the infirmary at Hogwarts. His friends don't die. Hermione and Ron are very much alive, but Ron sacrifices himself with his chess in the game of Wizard's Chess. Hermione stays behind with Ron, so he's abandoned by his friends, not out of treachery, but out of necessity, and has to face Voldemort alone. Devastation. Young man finds devastation at home caused by his absence. Not really, but Harry returns to the Dursleys. It's a full circle, and he finds that, of course, they still hate him. And they don't like him, and so he's still in the outs, and he kind of returns back to where he began. Now, the feminine journey, you'll see there's some similarities here, tends to unfold along the lines of what we call separation, liminality, and incorporation, SLI. And like I said, this is changing as we get heroines today. I think like in the Marvel and the DC universes, Wonder Woman and Captain Marvel and Black Widow. These are starting to kind of merge and change. We're at a really kind of interesting time in the kind of the development of the hero story. But if you were to look back through kind of the centuries of stories, feminine stories tend to fall along these lines: separation. Whereas a young man's story usually begins with a loss. Usually the loss of the father or some kind of problem with personal identity. A woman's story tends to be kind of born of innocence. The young heroine is virginal and she has no carnal knowledge. She has not a lot of knowledge about the outside world, but she leaves her town, often on kind of an innocent errand. Often she wanders off and gets lost. It's not she wanders off on a specific quest, but she kind of innocently leaves the place of security and safety. If you think of like Little Red Riding Hood, going off to visit grandmother. Persephone, of course, is a classic one. She's just gathering flowers with her friends, with her entourage, and when the moment of darkness happens. And so wandering off or on an innocent errand, usually she leaves kind of the city for nature. And so, aspects of nature are kind of naturally liminal: a meadow, woods, beach, lake, stream. She doing innocent things, gathering flowers, dancing and singing with her friends, and that's often where the moment of darkness happens. She's chased, abducted, sometimes raped, or sometimes even killed by a predator. And most interpreters, who kind of use this SLI kind of lens for these stories, tend to emphasize that the monsters in these stories tend to represent kind of a sexual threat. You think of Little Red Riding Hood again. The wolf is in the bed, dressed like grandmother, tempting the little girl to get into the bed. I think, from a Freudian point of view, it's kind of an obvious sexual metaphor. This is a virginal maiden, and so these stories are about kind of the threat of sex and the fear of crossing that line that cannot be uncrossed once it is crossed. So sometimes in these stories, the monster gets her. In most of the earliest versions of the Little Red Riding Hood story, the wolf eats her. The woodsman doesn't come along and kill the wolf and rescue her. That comes later. That's a later version. But she's lost in that liminal place forever. Sometimes the woman is transformed, and so she's not killed, but she becomes part of nature. She's changed into a tree, into a bird, or some other animal before she's caught. But now she's lost in that liminal place forever. And then incorporation. So either she's lost forever, in which the story has kind of this haunting, non-ending, as it were, or she escapes by the skin of her teeth, and then she goes back to the city. And very often, a feminine journey story, again talking about over the centuries of stories, ends with a marriage, and the woman is properly married, and she takes her kind of accepted role in society as a wife and a mother. So if you think in Greek stories, Orpheus and Eurydice is off just walking barefoot through the flowers, and she's bitten by a snake, and she goes down into the underworld dead. And Orpheus, her husband or husband-to-be, depending on what version you're reading, goes after her with his lyre, and he goes down into the underworld to charm all of the dead. And he plays such beautiful music that Hades says, "Yes, you may have your wife back, but on one condition, that you don't look back at her until you reach the upper world." And so Eurydice is following Orpheus up through the cavern. You can see it's kind of a hero's journey for Orpheus too. He goes down into the underworld to face death, to charm death, to rescue Eurydice. But as they're walking out, he hears horrible things happening behind him. He hears shrieks of horror and fear and cries for help from Eurydice, and he can't stand it. And he looks back, and she fades away, and so she's lost in that liminal place forever. Or if you think of Apollo and Daphne, Apollo struck by Cupid's arrow of lust, and Daphne struck by the arrow of disdain. He chases throughout the forest, which in the most famous version, Ovid's version, it's very clear that he has the intent that he's going to rape her. And the gods take pity on her at the last moment, and they change her into a tree before he can carry out that violent act. And so she turns into a tree, and so she remains virginal and untouched by men forever. Now, consider kind of a famous modern myth. It's always a challenge to find stories that a large swath of society is familiar with, particularly in this day and age, as our interests become so much more fragmented. But I picked The Little Mermaid as a story that maybe you grew up with or certainly know. So how does this work? Separation. A young virginal maiden? Yes. Ariel. The mermaid, a picture of innocence. She leaves her town, village, or home. She's curious, right? She's not sent off on a quest, but she's very curious about the human world above the sea. And her father warns against this, and so it's kind of it's a little bit of an act of rebellion. There's often kind of an act of kind of adolescent rebellion. You have to kind of push the boundaries to mature. I suppose that's kind of a universal truism. Um, she goes to a meadow, woods, beach, lake, or stream. Now, as I have here is Ariel being a mermaid. This is one way that kind of the formula is tweaked. She lives in a liminal place in kind of a more straightforward story. She's lives in the sea, and so dry land becomes the liminal place. And that transition from sea to land ultimately represents the psychological and ultimately physical transformation that the heroine will undergo. She gathers flowers, not really. She collects human artifacts on the bottom of the sea, which just kind of feeds her curiosity and her longing to know more things. Sings and dances often with other maids or nymphs. Yeah, of course, this is a Disney. This Disney film that I'm talking about. Of course, there's going to be singing and dancing. She sings for the wounded Prince Eric, falls in love. There's Flounder, Sebastian Scuttle, singing all the famous songs under the sea. She's chased, abducted, raped, or killed by a sexual predator, or transformed. Well, this is a Disney film, so any violence is going to be scrubbed. But there's still kind of this idea that what is Ariel's proper place? What's her proper civilized and at root kind of sexual role? It's threatened by the sea witch Ursula, and so her civilization, her transformation into a proper civilized woman, hinges on this ultimate transformation from mermaid into human. Incorporation, she's either lost forever. Well, not in a Disney film. As I'm sure some of you know, in the original kind of fairy tale version, the Hans Christian Andersen version of the Little Mermaid, she's at the end of the story. She's not married off. It's not a happily ever after. She turns into sea foam and just goes blows away, and she's lost in that liminal. She kind of becomes part of the sea forever. She's lost, but of course, a Disney film would never have that. So her status as a human, or transitioning from being a mermaid to a human, is the final problem that needs to be resolved. And yes, the power of the sea witch is broken, and because of the true love between Ariel and Eric, true love really replaces the gods or God in a Disney film of this stripe. True love, and here we're not really talking about agape, selfless love. We're talking about romantic love. That's the greatest power in the universe, and ultimately her father Triton, who's kind of a clear stand-in for Poseidon, changes Ariel from mermaid to human, and Ariel and Eric marry. So it ends in a marriage, and she's now kind of found her proper civilized place. So think about these things. Think about your favorite stories, your stories that have men at the center, that have women at the center, and ask yourself, does this sound familiar? Do these things play out along these ways? And then as we turn our attention to the specific hero stories of the Greeks, how well do these stories also map against what we've been reading and we'll be talking about soon? All right. Thanks for your attention. See you soon.